Bienvenidos, bienvenido, bienveni, welcome to tonight's panel on Latinx Identidades. My name is Nicholas Crookston. I'm a current senior at the university, studying political science and global affairs with a minor in Latino studies and a concentration in the Cloud Institute for Civil and Human Rights. Here at Notre Dame, I'm honored to serve as co-president of the Latinx Student Alliance. I am also a proud Colombian American and the son of an immigrant. And for these reasons, and many more, I am honored to serve as your moderator this evening. Tonight's event is sponsored by the Institute for Latino Studies as part of its slate of events for Hispanic Heritage Month, and is being held in partnership with the Latinx Student Alliance and the Office of Human Resources. It is important to note that this conversation is a reiteration of a panel that was held last year as part of Race Relations Week, organized by Amaya Medeiros in the Department of Diversity and Inclusion. And we are using adaptations of her thoughtful and nuanced questions to continue the conversation that she so passionately began last year. Before we begin, let's introduce our amazing panelists. Professor Marisol Moreno is the Reverend John A. O'Brien Associate Professor in the Department of Romance Languages and Literatures at the University of Notre Dame, where she teaches U.S. Latina, Latino, and Latinx literature. She is also a faculty fellow at ILS. She was born and raised in Puerto Rico. Her second book, Crossing Waters: Undocumented Migration in Hispanophone Caribbean and Latinx Literature and Art, recently came out in July. Dr. Moreno's teaching and research interests focus on Afro-Latinx and Latinx Caribbean literature and cultural production. She organized the Centering Blackness, Challenging Latinidades Latinx Studies Association Conference, hosted by ILS, on campus in July 2022. Profe Moreno is a faculty fellow at the Institute for Latino Studies, the Helen Kellogg Institute for International Studies, the Center for Social Concerns, and the Initiative on Race and Resilience, and she is an affiliated faculty in Gender Studies and Africana Studies. Dominic Blanco is a junior from the Bronx, New York City, majoring in computer science with a minor in Latino Studies. He currently serves as the Vice President for the First Gen Career Board Initiative, the Webmaster for National Society of Black Engineers, and the Community Outreach Director for both Society for Hispanic Professional Engineers and the Latinx Student Alliance. He also works as a career assistant in the Career Center and a TA for a Calc 1 course taught by Galvin STEM scholars. Dominic is pursuing a minor in Latino Studies so that he can learn about his Afro-Latinidad and Latin American history. He also wants to build a strong foundation in computer science so that he could be a pioneer in the ever-changing world. And I am blessed to know Dom both as an inspiring leader at Notre Dame and a friend. Professor Francisco Robles is an associate professor of English with specialties in Chicanx literature, African American literature, American literatures, and post-colonial literature. He seeks to examine literary and musical representations of migrants in the United States, spanning from the 1930s into the 1980s. Dr. Robles' current research focuses on literary and musical representations of migrants in the US. By exploring the historical and political ramifications of migration in 20th century American literatures, he constructs a narrative history and analysis of representational experiments that bring a focus on how migration sheds light on how citizenship, gender, ethnicity, and sexuality are imagined, experienced, and negotiated. At Notre Dame, Dr. Robles has taught a variety of classes on topics including American literatures, especially in African American and Latinx literature, migration, queer literature and film, and contemporary Latinx poetry and prose. And last but not least, Alejandro Campos is a graduate student in Notre Dame's Department of Political Science. Originally from Arkansas, the daughter of Mexican parents who migrated in the 1990s, she received her BA in Political Science in Spanish from the University of Arkansas in 2018, and her MA in Political Science from the University of Arkansas in 2020. Her research sits at the intersections of political behavior and identity politics, specifically identity formation, maintenance, and political mobilization of Latinos. Alejandra has conducted research on non-voting political behavior of Latinx youth, or Dreamers, conceptions of citizenship and belonging, and Southern political culture in the United States. In her doctoral work, Alejandra plans to build on this research agenda to study the attitudes and sense of identity of Dreamers as potential Americans in order to expand understanding of political engagement beyond the voting booth. Please give a round of applause for our amazing panelists. Great. I can relax a little bit. Let's begin by establishing a vocabulary and discussing the words that we use to define or invoke our Latinidad or Latino identity. There are many words that are used to denote Latinidad, but often little clarity about the meaning behind those words. Before we get into the discussion, and as a baseline understanding for our audience, the terms Latina, Latino, Latina, Latinx, or Latine are often used to refer to a broad pan-ethnic identity, including Chicano, Chicana, and Chicanx, and Puerto Rican historical minorities, as well as any individual with Latin American heritage. These terms are considered an alternative to the label Hispanic, often invoked by the government, in the census, for example, or the media. So, turning to our panel finally, in the personal sense, I would like to ask you all to please discuss how you navigate your terminologies and your vocabularies of self-identity, particularly but not limited to your understanding of yourself in relation to Latinidad. And the specific question is, which terms do you use to define yourself in relation to Latinidad, and what complexities and or contradictions do you face in expressing this relative to other identities to which you may belong? And whoever would like to start can go ahead and do so.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. Okay, there's several parts to that question. I will begin by saying that first and foremost, I define myself as a Puerto Rican. So I think after that, I would say Latina, as a Latina woman. It took me a while to get there. To be honest, having been born and raised in Puerto Rico, coming to the US and all of a sudden realizing that I was being labeled actually Hispanic. I remember receiving letters from the university about Hispanic this or Hispanic that, and I was really, really confused because I was like, what? I'm Puerto Rican, what, just honestly confused. And it took me a little while and some reading and some research to understand that that's how I was being viewed by US society. And with time, and also after learning a little bit about the history of the term Hispanic, which I think we're gonna get into later, right?
Yes.
Choosing Latina over Hispanic for sure, as a better option, or as a Latinx person, more recently too, but I think I gravitate towards Latina. I'm not sure how much more I want to say right now because I don't want to get ahead of myself in terms of information, but that would be a little bit from me. Yeah.
For me, firstly, similar, just say Dominicano, like Dominican American. Growing up in New York City, it was all just about cultures and almost like specifically Dominican, Jamaican, Haitian, and just etc. So then coming to Notre Dame, in such a shift of just identities, a lot of people would ask me like, are you light skinned, are you black, are you like even Afro-Latino? And then to me it was just confusing because like what is that? Like what does that mean? I just know like Dominican, Puerto Rican, and Caribbean. So now I like to just say Afro-Latino, but even then I'm still kind of in like the stages, like Professor said, of just kind of deciding what I am for myself. Still having to do some research, because although like for me Latino is like neutral, it might not be for everybody, just because like I might say neutral because I'm a man, but it also depends like what other gender you are. So I would say Afro-Latino.
I don't know if this is. Can you guys hear me through this mic? I can use that one too. I'm sorry.
Just mix that one.
Okay. All right. I guess everyone answers this question, I think, differently depending where you are. And this is sort of the answer I gave last year. But sometimes I think we make these compromises depending on the situations we're in. And so in political science, sometimes we talk about this, and I think maybe in sociology about like situational identity. And so like, especially here where I'm from, there's a lot of, a large Latino community. And so we establish our identity by sort of where our parents are from, the country of origin, right? I'm Mexican. But I think it depends on the group, right? I see myself as Mexican, but others might see me as Latina. They might question where I'm from. And so all these questions, I think you make compromises depending on who you're around and who you're with. And here at Notre Dame, I've made those compromises several times, right? When I introduce myself to my international friends, I'm like, oh, well, I'm American, because I know that I was born here and my socialization was here in the States. And then we develop those questions of like, oh, where are your parents from? How do you see yourself? And so I think we tend to make these compromises, and it can be kind of confusing because this vocabulary that we have to work with is kind of top down. But yeah, I don't know. I see myself as Latina. I see myself as Mexican. For a long time, I was like, I'm a Chicana, like I just really went with especially when I started my academic career, because, you learn a lot about like the Chicano movement and these really sort of leaders in like social movements. So I was like, that's me, like I'm a Chicana. I don't know if I consider myself that anymore because I don't know, but yeah, so.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to first begin by noting, thanking Nicholas for promoting me. I now have tenure, and it's on video, so nobody can take it away from me. No, I'm kidding, I don't. But, well, I'm just joking. I'm an assistant professor, which means I don't have it yet. But because it's on video, who knows? So I will begin by saying I do identify as Chicano. Very specifically, I know it's a little bit retro. Partially it's because of my own mother's story, but she was a farm worker, she worked in the union. For her it was very important. And so as partially an honor to her, I still use Chicano. Latino, Mexican, my father's Puerto Rican. So I sometimes will say Mexican. I will say Mexican American sometimes, especially with my family, because Chicano is actually still a divisive concept in 2022. When I lived in upstate New York where I was born, I identified as Puerto Rican, because most people in central New York were Puerto Rican or Dominican. I spoke Spanish differently, actually. But in the Midwest, when I moved there when I was 12, I began identifying more as Mexican and Mexican American. It's a really strange thing, what it means to actually move and contextualize your identity, precisely what Alejandra was saying. In terms of things that I think my identity is in complicated relation to, I will also say that as a gay man, as a queer man, they used to be a problem for me. They're no longer a problem. I've been alive long enough on this earth that really I have no problem with it anymore. But thinking about historically what this has meant and what it meant to come out in the early 2000s, it was a different time, it was a different place, it was a lot more difficult. But now as somebody who is very comfortable inhabiting all these identities, all these possibilities, yeah, that's how I would say, I would answer that question.
Thank you all. A little bit of football here, I think. Yes. So the next question that I have for you all is, what exactly does Hispanic mean? And to whom does that term apply? And we kind of touched on this a bit, but for those who didn't answer it, would Latino or Latina or Latinx be preferable to you? Whoever wants to start.
I can go. I have an answer for this because I was asked to provide an answer for this. No, I'm kidding. But I low-key was, but it's okay. So, we had like a meeting before we came here to make sure that we were all on the same page. But so I looked this up just to make sure that I wasn't giving you guys fake facts. But right, you kind of touched on this earlier, that Hispanic was added in the US Census, and that's sort of the term that we used for a very long time. It wasn't added until the 1970s. Before that, Mexican was added as a category in the 1930s, but it's just been super hard to get people to answer these questions on the census. And this has consequences for redistricting, for policy issues, and so as far as the census goes, it's a really big problem that we're not able to sort of come to terms with a label or a pan-ethnic label, because some of the times these surveys allow groups to have access to resources, and so it becomes a problem, right? But historically, Hispanic has been Spanish-speaking, right? Anyone who can speak Spanish, and so that has encompassed also Spain or European countries that speak Spanish, but then it also neglects other countries that tend to speak Spanish, right? We don't consider maybe like well, they don't, I might be wrong about this, but like we don't consider Haitians as Hispanic, right? Or even Latinos. And so it becomes a problem when we're trying to create a pan-ethnic identity, but it's still sort of excluding groups that might share similar cultures to Latinos. And actually, I saw this on Twitter yesterday. The Pew Research Center just came out with a survey where they asked people what indicators are most important to being Hispanic, right? Because we don't really even know what it means. And speaking Spanish is still the most important indicator, right? People still place a large value on being able to speak Spanish among first gen, second gen, and I think even third generation Latinos. And so there have been changes in the census, and whether or not we think they're good changes or if Latino is a better term, I think is still up for debate, right? This is sort of like a hot topic. Everyone wants to know what the best way to identify ourselves is. But in making these compromises, we're still excluding people. So I don't know what the answer is for a better term, but we're going to have these discussions, I think, for the next decade. So.
Well, stay tuned for Tuesday. There's another event. We're going to be discussing Professor Maricel Moreno's book, where I think there is a really solid answer provided for this question. What do you mean by Hispanic in the context of the Caribbean or Latino or Latinidad? Or even a colleague of ours who was here for a conference yesterday, Yomaira Figueroa. Her research touches on Equatorial Guinea, where they speak Spanish. So what does it mean that there are countries, nations in Africa, Western Sahara, for example, people still speak Spanish. Mozambique, people speak Portuguese. Angola, people speak Portuguese. But does the definition of Latino only define the Americas? Certain parts of the Americas? The question of Haiti is, I think, really important. Or what is Jamaica? It's Jamaica. Right, so thinking about these long legacies, or Trinidad y Tobago. It's just thinking about the linguistic question is so deeply tied to the identity question. So I love that answer.
So yeah, it's important to remember that the label Hispanic is a label that was imposed top-down by the US government and used continually still by the US government and the US media to refer to a conglomerate of people, a group that is quite heterogeneous. It is not a race identity, right? Because there are many races among Hispanics / Latinos. It's a pan-ethnic label, as been some of you have pointed out. So that was top down, and the root of it is Hispania. So it refers to the region that today we associate with Spain. Therefore, it's a label that privileges Spain and the Spanish language, right? That's why the label Hispanic, as used by the US government, refers to also people from Spain in the US. Again, these labels don't exactly, maybe they circulate now back in the countries of origin, but originally, I mean, they are the result of migration. They are used here in the US. They are not currency in the countries of origin, at least not until recently. We tend to define ourselves as Colombian, Puerto Rican, Dominican, Mexican, whatever you are. No, I'm kidding. Mexican, Puerto Rican, right? So the label Latino emerged as a grassroots reaction to Hispanic. Latino, first privileging the masculine, and people tended to gravitate towards that because it was more in the referent was Latin America as a whole, right? So it excludes Spain, but then it opens up the possibility of including people from Brazil who belong to Latin America, speak Portuguese. We have Haiti. I mean, we need to be including these groups. It's not just about Spanish, because Latin was the mother, like the root of Spanish, Portuguese, French, Italian, etc., right? So any of those technically fit within the definition of Latino, Latina. And then moving on to Latinx as a new development, more recent development to try to signal gender inclusivity, right? Along with that, the label still falls short. All umbrella labels are gonna fall short. It's too many people that are trying to be grouped together. It's not all negative, it's not like it's an insult, but they're also necessary for political reasons, right? So I think the important thing is to be aware that even the label Latinx, which is more inclusive because it also creates some space for indigenous peoples, with roots in Latin America and Afro Latinos, all of that, it creates more space than Hispanic, right? But still they fall short. And that is a debate that's happening right now among Afro Latinos, many of them calling to question, interrogate Latinidad, what exactly do we mean by that? Because in the end, it is a concept that privileges whiteness. So anyway, I can keep going for an hour.
Please do, we have an hour. We're gonna get into that more and deeper, and I thank you all for your answers to that, and I hope the audience is especially mindful that we ask that question as we are celebrating what is federally deemed Hispanic Heritage Month. So that terminology is very important as we recognize this month and who it celebrates being our community. The next, we're gonna turn to another key term. We're gonna discuss Latinx. What about the new trend towards the use of the pan-ethnic term Latinx or Latine in Latin America, right? As opposed to Latino or Latina? And what impact does the inclusion of relatively newer terminology have in our cultural identification? Who wants to take it?
Okay, I'll take a stab. So one more time, just the main point of the question.
Yeah, so we're just asking about the pan-ethnic term Latinx and what impact it has. Does the inclusion of this new terminology have in our cultural identification?
So that word, like both of them are new to me. Like especially I learned about them like when I came to Notre Dame. So like those words always often struck me as like I always ask people their opinions on them just because I don't know that much about it. But in terms about how I see, like if I would ask like my mom or like any of my family members about it, they would all just say Latino. And then like the same way if I go to Dominican Republic and ask my family there, they'd all just say Latino. So I think Latinx and Latina are great things. It's just the discussion is primarily being had in the United States because some people in the Caribbean or in Latin America or just wherever else don't have that ability to express or even like think about those kind of topics. So I think hopefully at one stage it will like expand and allow for different conversations and like allow for more people to maybe come to that conclusion themselves. Because I know sometimes some people say Latinx doesn't really flow off the tongue the same way Latina does. So yeah. Funny else wants to add anything?
Sure.
Okay.
Well, I was going to say in response to what Dominic is suggesting too, you do see some Latin American academics. I'm thinking of two in particular, one in Puerto Rico, one in Colombia, who they use consistently gender neutral language in Spanish. It is remarkably hard actually to do this because it literally means you have to reconstitute language in your head to add E's where there would be O's or A's.
Yeah.
I do know some scholars who do this, and they're monolingually Spanish. It's very difficult. And it in fact doesn't catch on, and some people get very confused or in fact hostile. Because if you're talking about hermanes, people say, what are you saying? And why are you saying it this way? So it's a difficult problem. I think that, Gloria Anzaldúa said it in 1987, it's like what linguistic identity is twin skin to my ethnic identity. We've always used language to talk about identity. I think this is like 40,000 years old, right? Who you are and what you say, how you say it, actually has historically defined people. There are stories in the Bible, for example, about people saying things slightly differently and getting in trouble for it. So it's all to say, it's a very ancient idea, but then I think, as Dominic is suggesting, just like every single idea, it really does take a long time to catch on. And for anyone who's ever tried to speak gender neutral Spanish, it is very hard because it's literally driven into us, the sort of gender binary of the language. It is very hard.
Yeah, I actually muted this word on Twitter because this is a discussion that occurs every month. And I just, I have nothing, I feel like I never have anything nuanced to say about this. Other than the fact that I think that Latinx and Latina are perfectly fine. I use it in my vocabulary, I use it in the papers I write, and I think anything that moves towards like inclusivity is always good, and so I've always tried to use it in my vocabulary. I will say I think another component other than it's sort of primarily used within the U.S. is that there is almost like a generational difference. And this is why I say I no longer identify as Chicanas, because when this Latinx buzz, started surfacing, what I refer to as Chicanosaurs, which are old Chicanos, did not appreciate, right? And you see this all the time. The Pew Research Center will come out with like surveys every year or every 6 months, it feels like. I think that's why I ended up using the word, where they ask people whether or not they like this term. And it's like people have a very negative reaction to Latinx and Latina, primarily rooted in how it's difficult to say in a Spanish language, and it becomes now exclusionary to people who primarily speak Spanish. So I don't know. The debate is difficult, and like I said, I think we'll have these debates about what we should call ourselves for like the next decade or two. But yeah.
I would say longer, probably. So, yeah, this is interesting to me too, as someone who teaches in the Department of Romance Languages and Literatures, right? I'm a professor of Spanish. Mm-hmm. So when I first heard the term, my reaction was negative, not towards what the X signifies, because I am all about that inclusivity, but more like breaking with tradition and with language, the way that Spanish has evolved. But then with time, I realized, well, Spanish has evolved. I mean, and this is how languages evolve across time. So just having more of an open mind. So in the end, I kind of switched it around between Latinx, Latina, Latino, whatever. Certainly don't judge people for using whatever they choose. I think we need to just let ourselves use whatever we want to use, and you cannot be judging people for the way they want to do that, right? But it is inevitable. Language is changing. The use of the E in Spanish, I could not do it. Like, I cannot speak that way, but I do know many people, usually younger, who can do it, right? So it's gonna take time. And again, there's no perfect term to define our identities. So I think we will be having these conversations over and over and over and over.
Thank you. Let's keep having them, for sure. We're gonna shift gears now to a different subject. We're gonna talk about inclusion and race. So turning our conversation to this broader notion of what is called Latinidad. For the audience, again, Latinidad denotes Latina, Latino, Latinx, Latina identity. That's the term in Spanish, I would say, right? Let's discuss that identity marker and the way that it has been used as both a mechanism of including and encompassing, but then also excluding and even erasing individuals and entire groups from our pan-ethnic community, right? For the audience's understanding, we can pull from scholar Paul Allison, show profi that I did my readings, from the Allison definition to understand Latinidad, as I said, as the designation for pan-ethnic Latino identifications, imaginaries, or community affiliations that are alleged to encompass, but not supersede, diminish, or destroy national origin or the multitude of identities within the community. And there are, within our community, various races, sexualities, genders, ages, and so on represented, right? But history has shown that Latinidad, in its application and its imposition within the mainstream, is often only beneficial to a select few. As scholars David Roman and Alberto Sandoval argue, the invocation of Latinidad rarely questions its own ideological and exclusionary purposes. So we're going to question it tonight. We're going to interrogate in tradition and mainstream the invocation of Latinidad and how it incites the question, who is included and ultimately excluded and erased from this definition? And the question, this is a long one, so we might split up. When looking at the complexity of the Latinx identity among races, how do certain discussions erase members from our communities, and what can be done to steer the conversation, right? So looking forward towards acknowledgement and inclusion. And I'm gonna ask this particularly within the Notre Dame context, but feel free to zoom out if you'd like. Big questions for whoever wants to take them first. Let's start with the first one, about erasure. Do we want to start with that, how Latinidad erases?
Okay, take a stab, sure. So, a little bit of Notre Dame background for me is I never really did my research and like kind of saw the statistics of like Notre Dame population. So when I came here, I didn't have the best understanding of Latino and like what I was getting myself into. So then when I got here and then I learned about like all the Latino clubs and Latinx clubs, I was like, for some reason in my mind, I was like, oh, it's gonna be all Dominicans, all Puerto Ricans. And then when I got to those specific events, it was just a broad range of completely different things, and it almost felt like, for me, like you could count the number of Dominicans on like one hand. And at first I had like a very negative reaction because it felt like my identity or like my culture identity was being erased. And now as I look back, it's more of an issue in thinking that it's the only viable one, but rather because of that, the word Latino encompasses all, I should try to, in turn, accept all of them so that others would like want to learn about mine, if that kind of makes sense. So it's like, at first I was like kind of like, I don't want to go part of this community, I don't want to be a part of this community because it doesn't represent who I am. But then at the same time, it's like that word, it's impossible for it to encompass everybody and like every identity. So it's like, you got to give or take and you got to just want to learn. So I would say it would erase, but only because some people are closed-minded as a result, like as an initial result. But like afterwards, you just kind of start seeing people as people. You just kind of like want to learn about their cultures, and it just kind of makes it all better.
Okay. Yeah, Latinidad as erasure. I mean, I think, especially now, these are the conversations we're having when it comes to Latinidad. But I would say, I mean, when people talk about Latinidad or what it means to be Hispanic, it's always been about erasure. Vasconcelos has this, I think it's a book, but it's called like La Raza Cósmica, and he talks about sort of the direction, I think of just specifically Mexicans, but how we're sort of this mixture, we're like this mestizo group, right? We're a mixture of all these cultures and races and ethnicities, and so we are sort of the ideal race. And you see that a lot too in sort of social movements and organizations that use this sort of la raza. And it's just such like, it just gives me the ick. It's like not a good word. It's like, it's completely, it's erasing many groups, indigenous groups, Afro-Latino groups. And so we, I don't know, I have this battle because I think there's something beautiful about like pan-ethnicity, and it's, when you're in a community like this at Notre Dame, that's a predominantly white institution, it's nice to see others and sort of recognize that you have some shared commonality, even though some shared history or culture or language or whatever it may be, even though, I don't know, there's still some differences among one another. So, I don't know. I appreciate that because it brings me a community that otherwise I wouldn't have here, but I'm in conflict with it, so.
And stay tuned, because I know what the last question is. So there's going to be a lot more, like, I think, happiness and joy in this. But also, I want to hold up what Dominic said, that it actually can be a space of exploration in a good way sometimes, but also sometimes because you realize that what does constitute Latinidad as a hemispheric concept, we share a very specific set of things. We were colonized. We're constituted by people who did not want to be here, who were displaced, or who wanted to be here. And this is actually really difficult to talk about. It's a history that's incredibly difficult to talk about. I think this is why I love poetry so much with the poet Derek Walcott. He writes in English, but he often thinks about what it means to be constituted as a colonial subject, what it means to be of African descent, Dutch descent, British descent, Carib, Taino. We do share this, but it's really hard to talk about, just like a lot of really traumatic things are to talk about. It's a history that's really awful to talk about sometimes. But the cultural efflorescence of now which is what you're talking about, Dominic, too, is you can actually discover things you didn't know. And that's really wonderful. What it means to meet somebody from Brazil or people from Chile who I rarely got to meet growing up, ever. And then suddenly, wow. I will just say, I want to hold that up too. It's difficult, but then again, what happens when you see it as, well, just, we can have these conversations across cultures in ways that maybe help us honor the difficulty, but also the joy. So thank you.
So regarding Latinidad, poet Alan Peláez Lopez, he's of Mexican descent, undocumented, queer, indigenous, and Black. He called for canceling Latinidad as a concept. And one of his arguments is that Latinidad is really, first of all, it's a construct, it's something we've made up. It really doesn't exist, there's no essence to it, right? And it's something that they feel erases them, their Blackness, their indigeneity, so much of who they are. So it is, they connected to, and it is connected to the idea of mestizaje, racial mixing, which is seen and Vasconcelos, right? He really put that concept out there in La Raza Cósmica to talk about how the Mexican nation was a mixture, right? And it makes it sound nice and democratic and, oh, we're all mixed together. We're the product of all these mixtures and it's great, but underneath that was the belief superiority of the white people, the Europeans who had, the Spanish who had colonized. Then the indigenous people, and below, the enslaved Africans. So mestizaje becomes a way of kind of hiding, hiding the racism that's underneath all of these ideas. Because in the end, it's about making the indigenous person become whiter across time. So blanqueamiento, whitening, right? So it's a very complicated concept. And those who feel excluded, like Latinos who are of African descent, indigenous descent, Asian descent, you name it, you can keep going, tend to feel excluded. So it is something that we need to be aware of.
Thank you all, and excuse me, I want to press a little bit harder, and I want to ask you all, and it doesn't have to necessarily be limited to the Notre Dame community, but let's kind of start there. What can we do to steer this conversation away from erasure, away from exclusion, if that's even possible, and towards acknowledgement and inclusion of all people that this term is alleged, again, to encompass?
Okay, so as a grad student, I feel like I'm not super entrenched in the Notre Dame community. I feel like we come here and then we're like in our offices all day and then we just come out of our shell like 5 days later. But I think the best way a community, so actually I'll give a little background. In my undergrad institution, we didn't have an Institute for Latino Studies. We had a multicultural center, so it was a bit different, but I think these institutions and these organizations here on campus have sort of the responsibility to lead these conversations, and I think there are so many events that ILS sponsors that they have sort of this like pool of resources that they could use to be more inclusive. Although I will say ILS is great, I'm just saying that usually the power comes from the institutions, right? They have these resources and these sponsors or whoever may be that can give the resources to the students to have these conversations like today, right? This is primarily led by the students and their initiative, and that's great. And it's great that ILS is able to fund this and give them this opportunity to ask these thoughtful questions. But there's always more. We can always do more. And yeah, that's all I would say. Yeah, I think these spaces tend to be dominated by like Mexican culture is my sort of perspective. I don't know about ILS events in particular or just the Notre Dame community in particular, but just even from my hometown, like usually we would have events and they were like very entrenched in Mexican culture, even though it was like supposed to be about Hispanic Heritage Month or something like that. So.
No, I'm always taking a microphone from Alejandra. I just wait till she says something and then I go. Thank you. So I would say that going back to an earlier comment I was making, it's always making space for these histories, these things that we know or have a hard time talking about. Last year I brought a poet. Her name is Ofelia Cepeda. It's a Spanish name. You might think she's Latina. She's decisively not. She's Tohono O'odham. They're people from Arizona and Sonora. Their names are Spanish only because they were forced to take Spanish names. If you've met people who are Filipino, it's the same thing. They're not Hispanic, they're not Latinos, but they have Spanish names, and there's a very specific reason for this. So being able to have these conversations, being, I guess, almost awakened by this, like, my God, there are, like, Spanish has, I don't know, it's moved around the world, it's transformed worlds, and I'm using that word very, I guess in this case, negatively, but it also does give us access to each other, to go back to Dominic's earlier point. So recognizing that sometimes there are people who maybe have a Spanish name, but it's not because their ancestors wanted one, right? I wanted to think a little bit too, and this is a little bit of a tangent, but not really. And thinking about something that Alejandra said earlier about Chicanosaurs. A couple of years ago in the news, there was a humongous debate about Mecha. Mecha is one of the most important student movement groups in the US. Started in the 70s as a sort of student outgrowth of the United Farm Workers, was very strongly affiliated with Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. It stands for El Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano de Aztlán. Chicano is a very important part of this. Most of the chapters are in Texas and in California. Many are in Arizona and in Colorado as well. But in California in particular, because these chapters are in high schools and in colleges, the majority of the students in them are not Mexican anymore. They're not Chicanos. They're Central American. They're Auditorium, they're Guatemaltecos, and they wanted to change the name of the group. And you would have thought that they had spat on their ancestors. The conversation was outrageous. They couldn't even talk to each other because the Chicanosaurs, people who I look up to in many ways, could not believe that these youngsters wanted to change their group, what it stood for. But I think of it as this, they didn't want to change the group and what it stood for, they just wanted it to recognize that things are changing and that the same concerns exist. But, well, Latinidad in Los Angeles is very different than it was in 1970. So that's just a small example, I think, of precisely this issue. And I think you can probably see this at Notre Dame as well. I think it was either Paloma or Gil Cardenas years ago showed me an old student, a course catalog. They used to be printed in Spanish and in English because a huge number of students came from Latin America. They're mostly from Colombia, Argentina, Chile, and Mexico. They were very wealthy. This was a really interesting fact to me. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about Latinidad here in 2022. So I just wanted to bring up those two examples. I know they're very tangential, and they maybe don't make much sense, but I think within this larger conversation, what can college communities do? I think in many cases it's listen to what students are asking for, and that's why precisely as Nicholas suggested, this was a student-driven initiative, and as Alejandra emphasized, this is the undergraduates who asked for this, and that's why we're doing it again.
I think you gotta be a little realistic sometimes. we only have 4 years if you're an undergrad. Besides that, it's like my freshman year, I just didn't want to be a part of like most Latino community. I kind of had like a mental block on my own, and like I wasn't ready for any of these conversations. And then a lot of students sometimes think they want to have these conversations, but they only get there after experiencing some struggle or like some like change in their life that makes them like understand that you need to talk about this and you need to learn about it. So I was like, I think events like these are fine, and it's like you got the students that show up, although like maybe let's say there's more Latino students or more like Latinx students or kind of whatever, but you gotta understand like the ones that are here are the ones that are ready, and like it all starts by like little change of them talking to their friends and their friends kind of understanding, oh, okay, because like to some degree like most of us come from like very, I would say, communities where like our culture is the most prominent in a way. So it's like for me in New York City, it's mostly Caribbeans, and it's like not a lot of people from the Bronx are gonna come to Notre Dame. So then it's like really hard to just try to encompass everything and like do everything, and just in doing everything you're always gonna exclude one. And there's like so many different things you can do, but I think small things like this event is great, having students come and like present their ideas. But in terms of just like what's more can be done, I guess it's like you gotta be a little realistic because it depends on like the class and the students who are here, I guess. And kind of like our professor was saying with like the Chicano and like changing the name, like it's all nothing's gonna get erased, but like you can't be attached to it because the newer generation of people are gonna come change it. So you just gotta feel like a professor, like someone in charge. You just gotta be open to what the students are saying. I think it's something we can all agree on. That makes sense.
I agree with everyone. I would say that to me, education is fundamental. So looking for courses that address some of these subjects is so important. But I really want to celebrate any student initiative that seeks to understand better and ask the difficult questions and listen to different voices. I mean, I think that's key. For instance, there's so many stereotypes about Latinos out there. One of them is that we all eat tacos and enchiladas, right? There's great diversity, we've already talked about that. But maybe you grew up in a Mexican-American community. Maybe isolated, where all the people around you were only of Mexican descent. How or why would you have knowledge of the diversity of all, of Latinos, even if you're one of them? Because the school curriculum does not cover any of this. So that's why it's so important to have those conversations here. And so there's a lot of ignorance, but it's not necessarily anyone's fault, right? It really depends on the context. Like, you grew up among Dominicans, you thought the Latinos you were gonna be Dominicans. It makes sense. That's what you expect based on your life experiences, right? And so we can think of many examples. But I think once you are aware and once you start learning, there are many of us, we're all very different. And the ones who tend to be excluded tend to be Afro-Latinos and Latinos of indigenous descent, Asian Latinos. Okay, well then let's start creating events that center those voices, because it becomes a learning moment for everyone. So I think that's gonna be really important. Whether it's through watching a movie and discussing afterwards, whether it's, whatever, even events like this, of course, right? So yeah, it's just being creative and promoting, learning along the way.
Thank you. And as a Latino leader and having another Latino leader on this panel and some of the audience, I hope that we are paying close heed to this conversation. And I definitely intend, and I think Don will agree, to carry this on forward in the work that we do during the time we have and pass it on to the next generations. So thank you all for that. We're gonna shift gears, and it's an election year, so we're gonna talk about politics. Each election cycle, the Latino community in some way or form makes a big appearance in the headlines as a key demographic, a critical swing vote in deciding elections at the national and the local levels. And in many ways, the statistics support this. Pew Research found that between 2000 and 2018, Latinos accounted for the majority of growth within the United States electorate. And our influence in this regard is already pretty pronounced. In 2020, 16.6 million Latino voters, 16.6 million, I love that number, Latino voters were reported voting. This is a number that represents, quote, the largest ethnic or racial minority turnout in 2020, according to Pew. Our community turns out in the millions to make our voices heard at the ballot boxes. And for that reason, the issues that impact Latinos and which drive us to the polls should be and must be important to politicians across the spectrum vying for our votes. So we're tasked with the question of what exactly those issues are amid the vast diversity of experience, perspective, and ideology among the Latino community. And it makes us ponder whether there is a such thing as the Latino vote or Latino issues. So, for that, we're going to turn to our panelists and ask this humongous question from your perspective. What is a Latino issue?
Depends who you're asking. I mean, first of all, housing, schooling, jobs, everything that everyone else is worried about, right? Then you can add preoccupations regarding immigration, right? That affect not only Latinos, but beyond other groups too. Depending to who you're asking again, you will hear, well, maybe I'm concerned about the wall and how across the Mexico-US border and how it's impacting the people there and the nature there. If you ask a Puerto Rican, they're gonna say, well, we're concerned about the status of Puerto Rico and as the oldest colony in the world. So it really, if you ask a Cuban, you're gonna hear something else. So honestly, we all have basic concerns, but it depends who you ask. So there is no monolith, there is no Latino vote. And that is a mistake that many politicians are making, assuming too much about which way people will vote.
I don't know too much about politics, but for my educated guess, I would say assimilation. Assimilation is a huge problem. Like, even for me as a first generation student, my parents are immigrants from the Dominican Republic. I'm Dominican because of my parents, but I'm also American. But if you would have asked me like 2 years ago what I identify as, I would just say Dominican and just say like, who just happens to live in America. But then now it's like, all the resources and like the person who I am is all based on me being in the United States and me being American. Mm-hmm. So it's like, now from there in the future, like growing up in the Bronx, me going to Whole Foods and caring about my health was like considered white. But it's just like me wanting to like make sure like my mom lives another year and doesn't get like any diseases that predominantly impact like the Bronx. And like from there, I think it just goes to like, for like most first generation students and even second generation, like where does the assimilation stop or like where does it begin in terms of just like, is me seeking higher education whitening myself? And I think that's like a very dangerous thing because what I've learned from most of my classes is just like sometimes white culture can just be the negation of the other. So it's like, in terms of just like the United States, white people, let's say like have the most social mobility, and then you would just say, oh, everybody else does not. And then if you're trying to move up the social mobility ladder, you're whitening yourself. And for me, it just kind of hits home because it's like me wanting to better my life and like better like my community so that we can enjoy our cultures more and not like give it up for like anything else. So I think a lot of politicians might not understand that, and they just go with like the stereotypical and like just like the random issues that don't really impact everybody, and more I think assimilation, and like even then like kind of you were saying like the Latino vote doesn't really exist because assimilation is something that impacts all immigrant communities that come in and all indigenous communities in the United States. So.
Yeah, I don't know much about politics either, so I'll see what I can spit out. But yeah, I mean, this is a problem every presidential election cycle, and it's been even particularly sort of a hot topic since the 2016 presidential election, right? Because we had a large number of Latinos vote for Trump, which, I mean, it wasn't too large. It was just mostly Texans and Cubans, but, you know. But yeah, I think exactly what you said, right? That we tend to sort of, or politicians maybe, elites tend to sort of default to maybe issues of immigration as sort of an important issue for Latinos, but that's not always the case. And I think it goes back to just this conversation we've been having all night about what Latinidad is and what it means to an individual, because that sort of informs what you think is important. And so if we're defining our Latinidad differently than someone else, then of course we're going to think that education policy or healthcare policy is more important than immigration policy. And all of this is also relevant to your history with immigration, right? Third generation, fourth generation. Latinos might not necessarily care as much about immigration policy as a second generation or a first generation Latino. So all of these are again contextual, and so it's difficult. And it's an even bigger problem for elites, right? Because really, as we have talked about, it is so hard to think of what a Latino issue is and to think about what Latinidad is, that the elites tend to just not mobilize us at all, right? Much of our mobilization occurs at the grassroots level. And so elites, they don't really owe us anything, right? Or that's sort of the perception that they have, is that they don't tend to owe us anything. And so the mobilization efforts come within the community. And this leads to a lot of sort of negative consequences down the line, right? Because we're sort of always neglected. We're kind of like the middle child. If any of you are middle children, you kind of know. So, yeah.
Well, I can't believe you'll let me go last, because I'm going to give a very facetious answer first. The first one's a little bit mostly a joke. Mostly, not really. It's a joke. The second two I'm pretty serious about. The first one I'll say is vegetarianism. As Cesar Chavez pointed out, if we're willing to exploit animals, we will let ourselves be exploited by anybody. As long as there's a category of creature that can be harmed because we want to, somebody's going to be exploited in that same way. That's mostly a joke, because I know nobody's going to be a vegetarian after this. But if you think about it, maybe. The second and third are related. Marshlands. We're seeing all of these hurricanes now. We're seeing all this destruction. Places like Galveston, in Mississippi, Louisiana, and Florida, and Puerto Rico. Hurricanes have existed longer than humans have existed. The lands dealt with these things. They were catastrophic, they were destructive, they reshaped the world. But we got rid of the things that are natural sinks and barriers. The marshlands are going away. It's about the creatures that live there, but it's also about the people. And the third is one thing that if you looked around this summer, you would have noticed. And this has to do very much with, it's a very complicated issue. It's monarch butterflies. How many did you see this summer? I saw 7 or 8.
Yeah.
One a week, maybe. These are migratory fellows of ours. They need Mexico, and they need North America. Rural North America, right? They need Mexico, and they need the northern parts of the United States. They need milkweeds, and they need the trees in Mexico. But the wall that was built on the monarch sanctuaries in the Rio Grande Valley was catastrophic.
Yeah.
The ways that, frankly, certain cartels are using butterfly sanctuaries in Mexico as graveyards is horrifying. And this is a really big issue. So it's a little bit facetious, because I started off with saying, don't eat meat. But also, I'm saying pay attention to your butterfly friends, because they tell us a lot about what people are doing to this world. And it largely impacts people who are marginalized. So, yeah.
Thank you all, and as you will notice, not one answer was the same. We are not a monolith. at all. So, we're gonna have a closing question and then a little bit of time for audience questions. So if you have anything you want to think of, do so now, please. For our panelists though, and this is something we'd like each panelist to answer. This Hispanic, this Latino, Latina, Latinx, Latine Heritage Month and beyond, what is the most beautiful thing about being Latinx? And what to you makes Latinidad worth celebrating?
I'll start. Just we'll move now. I think my answer is almost the same thing for both questions. Has to do with what makes it special, you said?
What makes it beautiful?
Beautiful. I think it's our history. Such a rich history. So many people coming together, not harmoniously, but we've created in our own culture, separate cultures, right? Something beautiful out of something that was pretty ugly. And what's worth celebrating is also that history and our ancestors and how far we've come despite everything that has come our way. And again, that's gonna vary from country and even region within a country. It's not uniform either. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
I might have to say something similar, but for me it's, I guess, our history and just understanding that like a lot of bad has been done, but I'm kind of happy, like one thing I learned in some of my classes is like a lot of bad things are done to a lot of people in Latino communities, different communities, but like one thing they just never give up is their dignity. And like that through it all just makes it so beautiful and like worth continuing to fight for. My parents just came from the Dominican Republic and then now I'm here and it's like a lot of people could see that as like a very negative thing and like almost feel like all that pressure is on you, but for me I think it's a privilege to just continue going off what my grandparents and like what my ancestors and what my parents did for me and just reminding myself that me living my life and bettering my own life also allows other people to like improve their own, kind of showing them like it's able to happen regardless of where you come from. So I just think it's very beautiful that like there's a very bad beginning, but there's like a beautiful ending that can happen.
I want to reiterate something I said earlier. Like for me, when even though this can be like a complex conversation to have, when I enter space and I sort of like see people who look like me and sound like me, it just sort of fills me with comfort almost. And I didn't have my first like Latino professor until I was a junior in my undergrad. And so I remember that experience was like very formative for me because before that I wanted to just like go to law school like most poli-sci majors do, which you don't have to do that, by the way. You can go into academia and get paid significantly less. So, but it was just, I like couldn't believe that I was taking like Latino politics. This was like a really huge deal for me, and learning about my history and having a professor who was like, yeah, we're gonna have a carne asada at the end of the semester was like super cool. And I was like, wow, I wanna do this. And so I think it's worth celebrating, and I think being in these spaces is important, like you said, right? We're sort of creating spaces for future generations to come, and hopefully that's what we'll all do. But, yeah.
Yeah. I can't believe I went last again. Exactly everything that they've said. I will also say, of course, family, which is very important, whether it's your own or one that you make your own, family. And I am gonna show myself to be a hypocrite because one thing I love about my family is they make the best menudo. And if you ever had it, that's not vegetarian at all. And I eat it. So I will say just family. What you will do for your family, that just, it matters more to be with them sometimes than it does, well, certain values or certain things. That sounds like a ridiculous answer to say. It sounds like I'm such a hypocrite and compromiser, but on the other hand, you know, the sort of communities that we make, they sustain us. So, yeah.
Those were incredible answers. Thank you all. Yeah, thank you. We have about 10 or so minutes for questions from the audience. Are there any questions? Let me just like pass that around. I think it's really good.
Thank you guys all for being here with us today. You know that these spaces, we talk a lot about how transformative they are, but sometimes they just help us breathe. And I really hope that that's what this opportunity has been for everybody. So you guys have all kind of alluded to the answer to my question a little bit, but I would like to ask it more pointedly. So first of all, did you guys know what you were doing coming into an environment like Notre Dame as people who value your identities strongly? What was your mission in doing so? And even if it wasn't part of your mission, right, because we don't always have to have a mission, sometimes we're allowed to just exist. Kind of how did you prepare for entering this space and what sustains you while you are here?
Okay. So, I mean, it's different because I'm a grad student, right? We have to make some sort of compromises when you're applying for grad school because a lot of it is about funding, unfortunately. For me, it actually, even though I went to a PWI at my undergrad, I went to the University of Arkansas, which was also a predominantly white institute. I was shocked when I moved here. I mean, I think the first year I was here, I cried almost every single day. I was like, I hate it here. There's no Latinos here. I miss my food back home. I miss like las tiendas. But over time, right, actually one of my grad school friends is right here, shout out to that. She's helped me out so much. She's in my cohort. And we've created like a community here, I think, where we have like weekly dinners and we have, we share our food. Laura's actually the best cook in our group, but when I cook, I make pozole and it's actually kind of good. So just having those times where you're able to sort of lean on your comrades. And I would say that at times, right, being at this institution does go in conflict with my morals and with my values. And it's difficult. But there are compromises that we make, and there are compromises that we're probably going to have to make the rest of our lives because of the sort of the institutions that exist, right? It won't end once you graduate from Notre Dame, right? You're going to go to another institution that will probably be in conflict with your values too. And so I think being able to find a community where you can sort of live with these compromises that you have to make is okay. It makes it a little bit more bearable. But yeah, there was no preparing me for this because I thought I was prepared because I went to a PWI and then I got here and I was like, this is different because, well, I guess also it's a private institution, so there are some sort of nuances there, but yeah.
Yeah, and I will say as somebody, I joined Notre Dame in 2017, so pretty recently in terms of being a faculty member. I did know exactly what I was getting to, yeah. But that's also because coming in at the faculty level was actually quite different. Mm-hmm. And I'm not going to get into all the nuances and what the decisions were and what the negotiations were and this, that, and the other. But I came here for a couple of reasons, and I chose this over another place I was thinking about. One was the Institute for Latino Studies. Mm-hmm. Dr. Luis Fraga did a lot to recruit me. And it meant
he does that. He does that.
Yeah, it meant a lot. And he has made a space. He really does, and he continually makes a space. My tocayo, Francisco Aragon, also, I think the way he curates literary events, it's incredible. This is a really vibrant space for literature and literary events. I will also say that, oddly enough, the English department faculty at the University of Notre Dame is one of the most racially diverse faculties of any PWI you can find. This is shocking maybe to you all. It literally is shocking. Besides HBCUs and HSIs, the English department itself, it's actually kind of remarkable. It's not, I think, where it should be, but when you look at it, we are more diverse as a faculty than places like University of North Carolina or Michigan, Stanford. It's actually remarkable. But that's also because of the institution building that people like Luis Vaga have been doing, that people like Mark Sanders, a colleague in English, has been doing and will continue doing, people like Maricel Moreno, who brings people in, who collaborates across units. So I didn't know exactly what I was getting into, but it's very different, I will say. There are a lot of other things we can talk about also, going back to the first question, the complexities of identity. I'm allowed to be an out faculty member. It's not hard for me at all. There are no problems for me. That's not true for students and it's not true for staff. And I know that for a fact. We are given certain freedoms as faculty members. I can leave. I can visit my mom and dad in Joliet as much as I want. I can, go to Western Avenue as much as I want. I can avoid campus as much as I want, except when I teach. But all the things I have the freedom to do, and that is actually a remarkable privilege as a faculty member. So that's why it's a very different answer than Alejandro's going to give and Dominic's going to give.
So I didn't know what I was getting myself into when I got here. Kind of just got a nice financial aid package, and I was like, oh, it can't be that bad. So one thing I've learned is to just, I feel like the school definitely, although like could be very different, I just try to be very optimistic. And I think that just allows me to have like a more better view of the world and kind of like knowing like it's worse and it's bad, but like I could be in the Dominican Republic where like having opportunity to study in the US is like very hard unless you're really wealthy. And then it's like, I'm here and like I have an office of student enrichment and like my friends in like camp, like even in NYU, they don't have that. And it's like, I'm outside of my comfort zone, but yet I'm still like comfortable. So it's like, morals are definitely involved, but it's like, I try to just look more of it as the people, because at the end of the day, like, if you work in a company, unless you own that company, it's kind of hard to change the morals. But one thing you can change is the people, and just like, meet new people and kind of like, exchange morals as an equivalent exchange. And like, one thing that comforts me is just like, those friendships that I have where like, I feel like I'm able to just talk to anybody, like even randomly, like, hey, what's up, I like your book bag, or like, hey, I like your shoes, like, oh wow, like you're from this country. Can I learn more about this country? So it's just about like being open and just surrounding yourself and finding people who like want to learn and care. Because although there's like maybe like a lot of negative people on campus, it's definitely like if you're negative, that's all you're gonna find. And if you just see yourself as like a victim to some capacity, it's gonna be very hard for you to like grow past that. But like once you kind of understand the state you are in, and you kind of understand like your life is in your own hands. So it's just like about doing something with it, I guess.
So I would say that I did have an idea of what I was getting myself into. I was pretty much terrified. My plan had always been to go back home to Puerto Rico, and here I was. I didn't think I would last a year in South Bend. I'm starting my 25th. So it's been a long journey. I've learned so many things along the way. What gives me hope is always my students, and I have a few here. Honestly, being a super minority here, because this is a white institution, and on top of that, when I came to Notre Dame, as a faculty member again, which is completely different from students and stuff, most of the Latinx faculty was, if the few that there were of Mexican descent, so Puerto Ricans, I mean, I think there are only 3 of us, 4. Anyways, very, very, very few. So it feels lonely that way, but we have, I embraced Latino studies, has also become a home, and I have also seen, through time, and I wanna think that it's partly because of some of my own ideas too, how the Institute for Latino Studies, which even in its programming used to be very Mexican-centered, has really expanded, right? Just look at the Afro-Latinx Poetry Conference that just happened the last couple of days, it's amazing. It's amazing. So I want to use my platform as a professor to, yeah, we are a few and it feels lonely sometimes, but I also, creating community. And yeah, I don't want to downplay the role that community, the one creates, can have. And Lord Garcia Peña talks about this a lot, community as rebellion. I mean, we need to create our communities, and that makes us stronger. And whatever, it's what gives me hope, right? For a better future. So yeah.
Thank you. We have time for maybe one more question.
Can we ask both?
Is there someone else I can?
Or can they ask both of them?
Just
At
your
once?
question?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, thank you guys so much for being a part of this panel. So my question surrounds adolescence or being a child. How did you view yourself as a child in relation to your identity versus now? Is there anything you wish you knew or any advice you would give yourself? And then on top of that, how would you describe Latinidad to a child?
I'll ask my question because I think it goes really well with one thing that you're implying, which is temporality. And when does one become a Latino? So by asking about a child, you are actually implying of people who were born in the US. And I'll start by saying I am Mexican. I was born in Mexico. I'm here with a visa and have been coming and going back to Mexico many times with a visa always. And I've never thought of myself as a Latino. I think of myself as a Mexican migrant who's here for some time. I'm not a resident. And I think many of the migrants who actually stay long term are in similar situations in terms and more so as coming and going. So the question is when does the term Latinidad also involve those who are here temporarily, or is it, should I be counting myself in, or does it only involve those who are either born in the US or are here for the long run?
I think those are both great questions and they do intertwine really well. One thing I kind of learned here is regardless of international status, it all depends on how others are gonna see you. So it's even me as a Latino, if I just see anybody who looks like, let's say, Dominican or just different kind of I don't even know how you can look Dominican, but that's besides the point. But I'm gonna also assume you're a Latino, Latina just to encompass everything. And when it comes to people from outside those communities, regardless of whether you're whichever status you're here on, everybody's gonna, not everybody, people outside of the community are gonna view you as that. So it's it's all about whether or not you accept yourself to be part of it. So it's kind of for me, I heavily rejected the Latino community my first 2 years here because I felt I didn't belong, or there was so much more to myself than the community could encompass. And then now it's realizing that regardless, in those past 2 years, everybody has seen me as Latino and as part of the community. And now it's because I've accepted it, now it's almost my choice, and it kind of makes it more welcoming, if that kind of makes sense. But, and also in terms of a child, I don't know, it's kind of complicated because for me, I wish I knew more about my history growing up. My parents never really spoke about it, I guess because a little bit of sheltering and just I don't really blame them, because you never want a child to be born knowing that their history is just not accidental, but more intermixing wasn't supposed to happen, and like all like that very negative history. So it's almost like you have to just show them the positive of it and then let them learn on their own, I guess. Like that's what happened with me. Like that's where I feel like it's very positive. But it's just very complicated. So yeah.
I will say this is why I still identify as a Chicano, because I grew up knowing I was a Chicanito, because my mom said so, and because she made me listen to De Colores all the time, because that's a song they sing in the fields to the kids. Because when you were union organizing and picketing, this is what you did. So I grew up listening to that Los Lobos album, Si Se Puede, like all the songs on it. I knew these songs. I grew up knowing these things because my mother, this is also partially an artifact of her being a 70s era Chicana, who was first gen. Well, she was a mechista, and she was a labor organizer, and that meant we had to know our history. We had to know exactly who we came from. That was a very different circumstance, I will say, right? And I will say that if you think of yourself, this is going back to the earlier complications, if you think of yourself uncomplicatedly as a Chicano, then it's very easy to tell the difficult story, because you don't have to talk about the really hard things about race or indigeneity, because you just, well, look, that's not our story, you say. But I will say one of the hard things was learning and realizing that when you look at the longer media history of Cesar Chavez, for example, he said horrible things about migrants. Because of the labor struggle, he had to make a very clear distinction between laborers in the US and migrants. And he used racial slurs. He very specifically asked for deportation policies. He collaborated in this way. He was a mighty, mighty labor organizer. But it came at a really huge cost. So that's why I look at other people like Emma Tenayuca or Ernesto Galarza, other labor organizers who thought transnationally about who was a migrant. Or you think about the women from Juarez and El Paso who were, they're called the bathroom riots or the strike. That they were just sick and tired of being made to delouse and take baths every single day. And enough was enough. They're binational. They're transnational. So thinking about that longer history, it makes it a little more complicated to sort of, well, everybody's a Latino if you want to be, just sing De Colores, right? Say Si Se Puede. How do you tell a child they're Latino? I don't know. Make them listen to music. But then, I think, being a good kid is actually really, that's such a good question. I think it gets to really complicated stuff because a lot of us are here. Well, it's a complicated story about how much parents value education and what they ask you to do for them. And the support they give you, but also, being at Notre Dame means a lot to a lot of people because it's football. It was famous, right? It's a big school that people know because it's Catholic, because it's football. And for a lot of Latinas, that matters. It really does matter. So I don't know what it means to be a good kid because your aspirations run into the fact that sometimes you're a bad kid. Or you are a kid who is gonna get in trouble if you do what you want. Or if you express yourself how you want. So maybe listen to music and listen to Madonna as well. So express yourself. Okay, that's what I'll say.
Should we?
Do you want to?
If
Do we
you have an
time
answer,
for
or, yeah.
So I don't remember anything from my childhood. I don't know. I have like the worst memory. Like before middle school, blank. I don't know what happened back then. I feel like your question is super interesting because I really don't know. Where I don't think that I think that conversation is difficult. It's difficult because in a way you're sort of even though we've talked about Latinidad as sort of an ethnic identity, but you're almost racializing your child, right? You're sort of their first experience with what it means to be Latino or Latina, and so it's difficult. But I will say, I think you just kind of know. I don't know. I always consider myself Mexican, but then this sort of Latina culture, right? The music, the dancing, the food. I think that encompasses much more than just being Mexican. And so I think at some point you kind of just come to the realization yourself. And I think it might be a beautiful thing. So it's nice to let someone just come to that in their own way.
Two great questions. I will begin by saying in terms of children, I think it just organically happens through the family in terms of the cultural background. You cannot necessarily teach your kids about being Latino or Latina, and you just transfer whatever is in you, the food, everything, all of the costumes. But there's also some wonderful children's literature out there. Many books that can teach about the diversity among Latinos. You know, like I remember reading to my kids books about not just, you know, Puerto Ricans, like children's books, but also about, you know, Dolores Huerta, you know, like there's so many stories from Colombia, from everywhere, right? Dominican Republic. So trying to do that through children's literature, I think is really important. And then in terms of how do you define yourself? Well, I mean, there's that discrepancy between how you're seen by society, because you can arrive like yesterday, right? And all of a sudden you're Hispanic, so that's the outside, right? That doesn't necessarily connect with how you feel. So I was born and raised in Puerto Rico, so we're already US citizens. I never consider myself like an American. I am a Puerto Rican. Then I get here and start seeing that people are calling me Hispanic or Latina, whatever. And I didn't feel that. So to me, I came as an undergrad, so I was over 18, right? So it took me many years to even say, oh, okay, I accept this identity as Latina. I don't have any problem with it. I feel like now so you cannot predict. I mean, it may take someone 3 months, it may take someone 5 years, that's kind of like what happened to me, or 10, or never. You don't have to accept it. Just be aware that people will put the identity on you and just whatever, you know, you can fight them. But yeah, so there's that discrepancy there.
Great, well, thank you all.
Thank you.
Great answers. Few final things. I would first like to ask our panelists to stand up and be recognized by the audience for their profound contributions to this conversation. I would also like to extend a note of gratitude and appreciation to the Institute for Latino Studies, the LSA, and the Department of Human Resources for organizing this panel. And before we leave, if you will allow me to share some parting words. This conversation is not in any way limited to this panel discussion. As we have seen, Latino identity is a diverse, dynamic, and sometimes contradictory experience. It is our job to move forward from this panel with clear eyes and open hearts, ready to keep the discussion going in honest, nuanced, and inclusive ways. So as we look to the rest of Latino Heritage Month and beyond, may this event be both a conversation starter and a call to action, to speak truth about where we've been, where we are, and where we need to go as a community, to boldly tell your stories and to uplift the stories of others, to forge spaces that are welcoming and just for all who call them home, and to come together as we continue to define our shared history and transform our communities here and all across the country. Thank you again. Have a great evening.